This is Next. I'm Kyle Clark. Today we are having a conversation about the conversation that we have about mass violence in this country, specifically how we in the media cover mass shootings and the people who perpetrate them. Joined around this table by Jack Healy, Denver-based reporter for the New York Times, as well as Caren and Tom Teves, who lost their son Alex in the Aurora Theater shooting in 2012. And it's been your campaign, your mission ever since to change the way that journalists talk about mass violence. People watching may also see some members of a documentary crew who are working with the Teves family. Your campaign, No Notoriety, has changed the way that journalists cover mass violence, at least in this newsroom it has. What is the basic ask that you're making?
What we're asking is for responsible journalism. We are asking that the First Amendment be kept intact, the why, the where, the how, even the who, but to report on the who in a responsible manner. And what we're asking is to just mention the name once, and then use subsequent descriptors such as the shooter, the individual, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the interesting thing, well, obviously we get calls, unfortunately, often. And that shooting that just happened in Canada, where somebody came in and shot the Muslim folks, a couple of reporters called me and said, when do we stop naming them? And I said, well, no one's ever telling you to stop naming him, but is he in custody? And they said, yeah, we caught him. Honestly, it was like the day after, and I didn't know if they caught him or not. And I said, well, then you need to stop now. If he's not in custody, by all means, put his picture everywhere. Keep the public safe. But once he's in custody, stop being gratuitous about it. We've actually called writers, and this isn't about you, but we've called writers, and this was 4 or 5 years ago before we started all this, or right after we started it. You'd have a 6-paragraph story about the Aurora shooting, and they'd have his name in there. Literally, we counted 41 times in 6 paragraphs. That's just, honestly, I don't even think it's creative, right? If I was you, I would, if I was your teacher in journalism school, I'd say this is a bit redundant, right? So the ask isn't to hide the name. The name's important. The ask isn't not to research, not to figure it out. The ask is stop turning them into heroes. Don't show them in threatening poses, because let's face it, most of these people are not threatening unless they get behind a gun and sneak up behind you. They're not threatening at all.
The ask, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. When I hear you mention journalists reaching out to you, as your position as an advocate or an activist on this issue, and asking you what to do, there's part of me, Jack, as a journalist that goes, whoa, is that what we should be doing? Mm-hmm. What do you hear in that process?
Well, this is a really interesting discussion. I, in 2013, actually wrote a story about the No Notoriety campaign, I think when it was just kind of, in its inception. There had been many other shootings subsequent to Aurora, and I think people were starting to really get this idea that we should stop mentioning the names of the killers. I wrote a story that did not mention the names of the Aurora gunmen or a couple of the other folks who had carried out some of these massacres that had engendered a campaign to not use their names. And during the editing process, an editor said, well, this doesn't make sense. We don't mention the names of these people in here. I think there's this natural journalistic instinct to be specific and to be descriptive. And I think that a lot of the people in newsrooms haven't gone through what you guys have. They haven't experienced that trauma. We don't know on a visceral level what it's like to see the image or the name of the person that killed your kid over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the reasons why there may be, a certain cognitive dissonance, because it's a lack of familiarity, with what you guys have gone through. On a journalistic level, there's also, I think, this real desire to get as much information about these things as fast as possible and dig and dig and dig. And I actually wanted to ask you guys, if I may, when there are shootings like the one in Canada, when there are these kind of San Bernardino and these things, how do you guys consume the news now? Do you guys try to sort of not read about the descriptions of these gunmen? Do you just sort of turn it off, or what triggers in it?
Well, I'm a little concerned with the perspective.
Yeah.
Our perspective has nothing to do with our feelings.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with me having to see that thing that killed my son. I sat in a courtroom with him was 6 months,
Yeah.
you know, and it's not about that. It's about, do you have children? Or are you going to have children?
Mm.
And do you want them to live? Because if it could happen to me, it could happen to you. So it's not about us. It's really not about the victims. That's
Yeah.
not what we're here for. We're here to stop the call to action that every time you take, which is essentially suicidal people that want to get their moment of fame. That's the goal, to stop them. So what you have, from a journalistic perspective, you have to understand what we're saying. Because we have a lot of people who say, well, what are you saying? So we say, go on the website and read it. And they still come back, well, you're telling us not to name them. We never said that. Name them once. If you got to name them once in the story, and then I would say call them the coward, because anybody who sneaks into a public school and shoots 26 little kids with an AR-15 is nothing but a coward. Certainly not an American hero, right? But you can say the name once. After that, everybody knows the name. What you need to focus on is the heroes if you want to write stories. Because I get you guys are in, you have
Sure.
to have content, right?
I have to ask you this, though. How do we approach the killer's why? Because I think the why matters if we're
Without
interested in
question.
stopping future incidents. But quite often, this desire for notoriety or the desire to push a message is interlaced with
It is
that
the why. Yeah, it is the why. So when the why becomes, when you do the research and you understand that the why comes back to what you guys do for a living, if you're responsible, you need to modify. I'm not saying you need to suppress, because no one's saying that. You should do all the research. Maybe there's something connection with these people that, and I think the main connection is the desire for notoriety. But when that comes out and you ignore it, and I'm not saying you guys ignore it, I'm just saying if it's ignored, because there's a national newspaper that loves this stuff, okay? And I'm not going to name it, but I don't have to tell you who it is. You know who it is. Now I sound a little like Donald Trump, but there's a national newspaper. It is the why. So when you do the research and no one's telling you not to, and you come out with like, oh, this is inconvenient, right? We're kind of in the middle of this. You're not the reason, or you're not the sole reason. But if you look at each one of the killers have studied Columbine. The guy from Mbunkwa, or how do you say it? Umpqua. He said, I wanted to do it because the more people I kill, the more fame I get.
Shooter in Oregon.
Yeah, the shooter in Oregon.
You use the word responsible, you use the word reason, so I want to bring up the fact that any newsroom discussion about what we do and how we do it, if we're looking to minimize harm or that responsibility, implicit in that is the fact that what we have been doing has contributed to the deaths of a lot of people in the U.S. And I think there are a lot of journalists that would disagree with that, or that don't want to consider that. And I think that there are a lot of journalists that have now started to have this conversation. And I'd like us to have a frank conversation about whether you two believe that journalists played a role in the death of your son.
Well, if you think about covering suicides, for example, how do you cover a suicide when you report?
I mean, we tend...
If you report.
Yeah, I mean, as a national newspaper, I think we tend not to report on individual suicides. You may be getting to the issue of suicide contagion.
Exactly.
That's exactly
there is
what
a
it is.
proven contagion effect with suicides.
It's happening right here,
So
right now.
what we do is we don't report on suicides to stop the contagion and to save lives. This is basically the same thing, because there is a proven contagion effect with mass violence, mass shootings.
Rampage mass killers, yeah.
Exactly. And this is what we're trying to address. And to follow in the same protocol as something like how you don't report on suicides.
Let me ask you this. I have different leeway in my role as a television journalist and someone who does commentary than Jack does writing for the Times. I've made the decision, and the folks here at 9 News have made the decision, that they're comfortable with not only embracing the spirit of no notoriety to minimize the use of the killer's name and image, but then also being transparent with our audience in terms of why. So that why in a newscast looks like 9 News is minimizing the use of the killer's name and image. What it looks like when I'm doing commentary is on such and such a date, this person was killed by a shooter whose name doesn't matter. Does it matter to you that our why is explained to people? Or is the contagion just about seeing that image, hearing that name?
The contagion is a call to action. It's knowing that if I commit this type of violence, I will instantly become famous. And we've seen that. The killers have said that. They've said, like the Umpqua shooter said, everyone will know my name. Everyone will know what I've done, and people will know who I am because of that.
Well, what did the thing that killed my son do? He said that the more people I'm no good at science, so I want to be famous. The more I can be famous by blowing people up. I mean, he said that to the psychiatrist because he's the one of the few that lived. Because remember, most of these people are suicidal because they go in and kill a bunch of people so they can get this fame, which is kind of counterproductive if you're thinking about it because you're going to be dead. You're not going to enjoy any of the fame, but that's what they think is important. And let's face it, they're mentally ill to begin with, right? So that's a whole nother issue. But you know, you have to realize that if they're suicidal and you don't put the names of suicidal people on the newspaper, why in this case? You got to kind of ask yourself that. But as far as your question, no, I think it's fine. I think the more you do that, the more you say to that individual, and I always say in their mom's basement, but that's probably me being a jerk, right? But that individual who's at risk, because these are mentally ill people. And I don't even want to get into the conversation about mental health in this country because, I haven't done as much research on it as I have at this. But they're mentally ill people. We don't need to give them a call to action. And there's no other than to sell newspapers or to gain clicks or to get viewers. That's the only reason you do it. It has no basis to the story. If you said Tom Teves is here and you introduced me as Tom Teves, you don't need to keep calling me Tom Teves. If you watch the show, you know who I am, right? So it's redundant. There's no reason. I don't think it's wrong to say why, but I think you just need to look at it and say, what happens whenever we have, and you're being very gracious, Jack, right? But when you get into these conversations with people who aren't so gracious, and I know I seem very meek and mild, but I will speak my case. You get to the point when you show them, the FBI, the International Brotherhood of Police Chiefs, the police officers, the people alert who train everyone how to deal with mass shooters, all say, don't name them. The American Society of Psychologists say, don't name them. These are all people much more expert than anybody at this table on what's going on in that brain. And we're going to, no, I'm not saying we, but certain journalists are going to say, well, I'm going to ignore that and just name him, show his picture. Why?
I think, well, there's a certain pomposity that comes when you name someone's profession in the Constitution, the only profession named in the Constitution. And I know that there are a lot of journalists that automatically push back anytime they're told by a non-journalist
yes, that's exactly
what to do.
Right. Yeah.
That's just a fact. That was my first reaction when I heard about No Notoriety. Don't tell me what to do.
You know what you say that? What's
fun? Answer that we hear all the time.
Whenever we get into the argument, and you make the argument, and you go down the road, and then it gets to that point because the facts. It's not that I'm a brilliant orator. The facts are completely in my favor. It's impossible to ignore. I mean, all the experts. ASU did a research study and proved that there's a contagion. So you get to that point where you've refuted each statement. That's what you get. You get from, and we got this from the dean of a very large university that I'm not going to talk about when we were at the SPJ, because the SPJ has a panel every year that we talk about, we get invited to. And that's exactly what he said. He said, you're not going to tell me what to do. And you could see it on his face as soon as the words come out. He said, I shouldn't have said that. Oh, no, especially to this guy, right?
Yeah. To address the why again.
Sure.
I think as the general public needs to know the why. I mean, because we need to see these red flags. and to be able to report to something like Safe to Tell or something like that. We need to understand these red flags, and that comes from understanding the why. And hopefully we can also get to a point where we can try to stop these things just by someone saying, hey, this person needs to be looked at.
So back to this idea of journalists saying, you won't tell me what to do. Underlying that really clunky and cringeworthy phrase is the mission of journalists, which is to inform. And I understand what you're saying about clicks and ads and everything else, but I don't own this TV station. He doesn't own his paper. Both of us are in journalism to inform the community. And behind that idea of don't tell me what to do, there are real ethical judgments that are made in the interest of the community by well-meaning journalists. And maybe, Jack, if you can speak to that, where some of that pushback comes from in newsrooms.
Well, I mean, I think in relation to this, the reason that, at least, a lot of journalists, I think, use the names of these shooters is that, there is a necessity to be factual and to be as specific as possible. And in some cases, early on in these investigations or until the judicial system has made a determination, you can't necessarily call them the killer or the gunman because these things haven't been adjudicated. And sometimes, those
and you could get
issues or
sued
whatever.
and all that.
Yeah. But I think that we really do need to examine these things. I mean, the way journalists cover suicides now, I think, has changed dramatically. I think that there's a lot of people have gone away from talking about like the ways people kill themselves and things like that because of the contagion issues. I mean, one of the most pressing questions, I mean, you guys know this, that you have to deal with after you hear the report on the scanner. Journalists rush to the scene, they try to talk to everyone, and then in the minutes and hours later, it's who did this and why and how, and I think there are a lot of really important accountability kind of questions about how these things keep happening and how they continue to happen in particular circumstances that you have to delve into. And they lead to stories that sometimes, delve very deeply into the lives and the backgrounds of these people.
Which is okay.
Yeah.
But here's the question I have to ask you, because you talked about facts, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
So we always should stay with the facts. And understand, we believe more now than ever that journalism is a very important part of our government and why we're free. So this is an attack on journalism. We need journalists. But so let's go to Sandy Hook, okay? You rush in. You got a couple of choices, right? You can try to find some footage on Facebook, hold a gun. Or you know what? Go take a picture of him in the morgue. It's the same person. It's the same person. You're not changing the facts. But you're taking that call to action and showing that next person who wants to do it. Here's where you're going to end up. You ready for that? Because that's where you're going to end up. You're not going to end up like this powerful figure on the news. No, we're going to show you in the morgue. We're going to show you dead.
You speak, though, Tom, to the idea that journalists make choices. We make choices every day. We're guided by a code of ethics, but we make choices. And we have a general assumption that more information is better than less information, but it is not an absolute.
Sure.
Because Jack and I also make choices every single day to err on the side of minimizing harm while maximizing information.
Code, right?
And that's where we get to the tough point, which is how do we minimize the harm while maximizing the information? And while my initial reaction the first time I heard about No Notoriety was don't tell me what to do.
Yeah, it's normal. Don't feel bad.
You convinced me based on the idea that every day I make 100 other choices on how to maximize information and minimize harm, and why would I not consider this as an opportunity to maximize information while minimizing harm?
And it's a new way of thinking. I mean, I think there's a lot of journalists that don't even know about No Notoriety or considered it. And that's why we talk about it as much as we can, to give them the option to say, wait, let me consider this. And I have a huge responsibility as a journalist to the people that I'm putting my information out to, and to take that seriously and realize that you can change people's lives in what goes down on that paper.
Are you guys making progress?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
huge.
unbelievable progress.
Yes.
I mean, we went on reliable sources a couple years ago, and normally, if I'm going to be on something, I will say, look, I'm not, because do I really want to be on television? You want to be on television, you want to be in a newspaper, I want to do my job. It has nothing to do, believe me, being on television, it doesn't help, right? But we went on reliable sources, and we had the whole conversation. So we get done, and it hits me like, because it happened really fast for some reason. When we flew to New York, and I said, as I came out, because I said, we didn't tell him we won't go on anything that if you're going to show the killer's picture, unless you're going to show him in the morgue. We're cool with that, right? And he was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do that. So then we did another 45 minutes in the dressing room of, this isn't going to work for me, right? I'm telling you right now, then don't run this. And I'm sure he's thinking, I just flew people across the country, and
we had the discussion.
yeah, we had a long
And
discussion.
you could tell it was clicking and clicking and clicking. He said, I do have this responsibility. By the end, he came out and he says, I don't know what I'm going to do. I may or may not show
And
the
we let it
photo.
go.
I'm going to consider it further. And then the next morning, we watched our interview for the first time, and he said, I was going to start this show by showing the picture and saying the name of the killer. But after speaking to Tom and Caren Teves and the whole No Notoriety protocol, I've decided I'm not going to do that. And he has been a huge supporter ever since.
I'm sorry.
I just think it's just a new way of thinking. It might be different from when you went to school and had your training, but now when Tom speaks at the journalism schools, you can tell the kids that are going through these programs are thinking about it, and they're very supportive of it.
When we're
They
at the
agree with it.
when we're at the SPJ, and I go on a panel every year with a couple other, obviously opposing points of view, so to speak, which is cool. I have no problem with that. Literally, I end up like, I think I'm a rock star or something. There's so many people who say thank you, especially young people, young journalists saying thank you. Somebody needs to say that, and it comes to me that what I've seen at this point is, I think we're making progress with you guys. Somehow we need to get into the executive office and say, hey guys, you got to make the right choice. Stop, do the right thing. Because you know what? The millennials, as they come up and start controlling, they're going to hold you accountable. Anybody, they're going to hold companies accountable. I mean, Kellogg's isn't taking GMOs out of their cereals because it's cheaper, right? They're taking them out because they know from a commercial value they have to do it. So I think you guys need to push that up to your executives to say, hey guys, this is going to have a commercial problem for us. And I don't mean commercial, I mean revenue problem. Because pretty soon people are going to turn us off. We have on our website, we have a rolling poll. It's always about 95 to 98%. Of course this makes sense. And I think 2% or 2.5% are journalists who don't tell me what to do, and the other half are people who want to shoot people. So
I have to ask you about one thing, though. We've talked a lot about journalists. You're also asking something of law enforcement. And this is where I start to have real trouble with it. Maybe you can convince me here at the table. When I hear law enforcement in front of cameras on day one after an incident saying, I'm not going to use the name, I'm not going to say who the killer is. As a journalist, that scares the hell out of me, because that is the government telling the public, we're going to cut you off from this information. Help me understand what your ask is of law enforcement and why that isn't something separate and apart and, in my mind, more dangerous than journalists exercising discretion when government officials say, we're not going to tell you who did this.
Well, but that's not what they say.
That's not
Let's
what
be
they
clear.
say.
That's
Okay.
not what they say. What they say is, I, as an individual, a person who's dedicated my life to protecting the public, realize that if I make this thing into a bigger than life character, I will get somebody else, either in my community or the way the world's connected now, it might not be in their community, to possibly do this. I'm not going to keep you from the information, and if you want to be irresponsible, do a little homework, you can go into and get the records, but I'm not going to stand at a mic and use their name, because I know, as an expert in keeping the public safe, that this is going to cause harm to someone else, or at least possibly.
Let's play it out. What if he says, I'm not only going to not stand at the mic and say it, I'm going to make it hard for you to get the record, because I believe that if you have the name in the record, then that will have the same contagion effect.
I don't think he has the legal right to do that.
And
I don't think I've ever heard of somebody do that. So what he's saying.
Nor have I. I'm just saying if you play that out,
no,
okay,
absolutely not.
because you're not talking about blackouts.
No, we're
not
talking about
censorship
responsibility. Yeah.
or anything like
Yeah.
that. We're
No.
just saying don't make these people famous.
And that's what drives us a little crazy. Read the website. Not that you don't, but it never says don't name them. Name them once, move on.
But you put an idea into somebody's head, and then they make their own decisions. All I'm saying is you guys are very explicit about what you're asking of people. And it does bother me when I see people argue against no notoriety, and they argue against stuff that you haven't said.
It happens all the time.
They argue against the blackout.
Yeah.
Which I think we can all agree for myriad reasons, a total blackout of the killers' names would be a problem for so many reasons.
Sure.
Researching their motives, researching
Nobody's
their past
asking
history,
that, yeah.
creating a cult status around them, they become the forbidden fruit. That's not what you're asking, and
course.
people will argue against that. But I'm just curious, what happens when people take your idea, especially people with power, more power than me and Jack, power, and take it to where they think it should go? That's what I'm asking you.
Well, and I would counter back that the world's changing, right? Social media is going to call everybody to task, right? Now there can be fake news or alternate facts or whatever, and there's wacky stuff on the internet, but smart people figure it out, right? I don't think there's anybody in our world today that's powerful enough to block it out. And there's a YouTube video of a national newspaper talking about No Notoriety. They obviously hadn't read anything because their argument descended into fiction. They were starting to talk about Lord Voldemort in Harry Potter, and we can't do that because the one we don't name is more. Read the website. It says it right in the first thing. I mean, I laugh because they're supposed to be journalists and we're talking about facts, and it's a click and you read. It's not that hard, right? That's never what we're saying. You can know the person's name, but let me ask you this. Do you know the name of the person who committed the Tucson shooting?
Sure.
Okay. There was a little girl there. She was born on 9/11. She was supposed to be a hope baby, right? Because 9/11, we all know what happened, right? Mm-hmm. What's her name?
I don't know.
Sad, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's sad. And that's what we're saying. You know what? People should know her name. Do you need to know his name? He was nuts, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and they're all nuts. No one goes, if I came and shot you unless, I'd be nuts no matter what, right? So, yeah, I think you have to look at it from that perspective. But it's not Lord Voldemort. And I had to laugh because we're talking about a major newspaper, and the editor saying that, I was laughing when I watched it. They went into fiction. That's their best argument?
And they did descend into they're not going to tell us what
yeah,
to do.
and they're not going to tell us what to do. I can show you the YouTube clip. It's hysterical.
In our time remaining, I want to go around the table and get final thoughts from everybody about something that hasn't come up yet, but any piece of information that you would like people to hold in their mind about this. Because if they're watching this extended discussion, they care deeply about this subject. So, Jack, what would you say to people that they need to keep in mind as they discuss this topic, as they talk to their friends about it, as they talk to their family about it, as they talk to journalists in their community about it?
I mean, I think that after these mass shootings, journalists are doing a number of things. The first is that they're just working as hard as they can to get accurate information in conditions that are really difficult, that are probably the last thing any journalist wanted to do when they got into the business, which is to call grieving families or to try to talk to witnesses who have seen horrible things. And I think that a lot of the times there's just a reflex to put out as much information as possible, as fast as possible, and as accurately as possible. I mean, I think this is an incredibly important thing to think about and just start, reconsidering like the number of times you use the urge to reuse an image on subsequent coverage. I mean, I think I think that the public has a right to see what these people look like, their images, initially at least. When there's a story 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later about, for example, the Aurora gunman's prison status, where he is or what penitentiary he's in. I clicked on an article and his mugshot was the image at the top of the page. And I don't know if that's necessary. And I've had some conversations with photo editors about, like, when doing subsequent stories in the years after Aurora, maybe let's not use his image. Maybe if we need to use a picture for the story, let's use a picture of the scene. Let's use a picture of a memorial or something like that.
And whatever we do, do it intentionally.
Yeah.
Intentionally.
Because the idea
reflex,
that
you can be
and habit, I think, are the things that you're fighting against in certain ways, and just like this way of that. We name people, we show the image. I feel like it's just sort of like the way things have been done.
And it's funny, you're so right, because we did an article with a woman, and she committed. Article came out. Whoever, and I don't know a lot about it, but I've learned enough about newsrooms. I guess the picture editor put in these pictures, and we were livid, and she was livid too, because she couldn't control it. It took her half a day to get the pictures off.
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying. Yeah, and it's just muscle memory, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think back to sitting through the trial, and the prosecutor, George Brockler, very intentionally did not use the gunman's name. His defense attorneys very intentionally did, I think. But then you had the judge, who was sort of supposed to be this neutral arbiter of the law, who did address the defendant, in a very polite way, using his name. And sometimes I think that sort of journalists try to see themselves as sort of that position of neutrality, not being on one side or the other of an adversarial issue. But and maybe that's sort of some of the resistance, is that some journalists feel like by not using these names, it's almost like they're taking sides. I mean, it's hard to say that you should be on one. You shouldn't be on the side of not the victims of a shooting. But I mean, I think that might be some of the resistance you get.
Well, we're asking you to be on the sides of the people who haven't been victimized yet, and will be if we don't change.
Yeah.
Caren, want to hear from you before we wrap up here in terms of what you would like people to consider, whether they are coming to this for the first time or whether they're reconsidering their point of view as a result of our discussion.
Well, I think that growing up now for kids, I mean, they know the world of mass shooting. We didn't know this growing up, and it's a real problem and a real issue right now. We're just trying to save lives. And I think it's trifold. I mean, you have mental health, you have the easy accessibility to guns, and then you have the contagion effect of infamy. The other two, it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take years to address that. But with No Notoriety, it's something that can be addressed now. It's a personal choice to be able to do that. You don't have to worry about trying to get laws passed. And it's something that we can do immediately to curb and to try to reduce violence. And I think it could be very successful. And I also have one thought, and I usually end the conversation on this. Where would we be today if, after Columbine, we had embraced the No Notoriety challenge and did not make those killers famous, basically? Where would we be right now?
If you did the research, almost every one of them researched and basically made into heroes, the two Columbine kids.
I believe our son would be alive today.
I appreciate all of your perspectives. I would encourage everybody who's watching this, who's thinking about this, to think back to what Tom said earlier, which is that it's not about you guys. It's not about Alex in the sense that it's about everybody else who's around and what are we going to do going forward in the future, and to consider your argument outside of the bounds of your experience almost. It's very difficult to have a conversation with the two of you and tell you, no, I don't think so. But that's not what you're asking people to do.
Just think about it.
Consider the argument on its own.
That's exactly
as
right.
it stands. We'll put all those resources on the next Facebook page and at on9news.com for anybody who wants to get into it there, and then just consider what they're saying. Jack Healy from the New York Times, Tom and Caren Teves, thank you for coming up. It was great to see you guys again.
Thanks for having us.
And all three of you are welcome here anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.